going on, guys? Welcome to episode 28 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. Today, Josh and I are going to be going through a bit of a conceptual conversation going on for one of our publications that we were recently a part of, kind of talking about proximity to failure and the overall scope of the research there. We're going to discuss a little bit about identifying and just a conversation around strength limiters in general and kind of our recent thoughts on how that would potentially influence the way you're set up training for strength. And then if we have time at the end of the show, we're going to get to a few listener questions. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Josh here. Josh, the lead author of a recent review paper, like I said, that we were lucky enough to be a part of with some of our colleagues from our lab here at Florida Atlantic University. Josh, go ahead, take it away. What was the title and all the good stuff?
Yeah, man. So I think the first thing to emphasize, kind of like you alluded to, is that very much a team effort here with a lot of contributions from everybody involved. We'll go ahead and link the paper in the description of this podcast, and you can check out the full text there. But the title of the paper is Methods for Controlling and Reporting Resistance Training Proximity to Failure, Current Issues and Future Directions. So basically what we look to do with this paper is to think about the proximity to failure question kind of from a higher level in terms of what can we actually, answer, right? What limitations are there in terms of the methodology used to answer this question, and what are the best ways forward from there, from both a practical perspective and from a research methods perspective, right? And we've talked about this on the podcast before of like, we're not very comfortable giving very specific RIR or RPE recommendations or saying this proximity to failure is better than this other proximity to failure. And the reason for that is largely summed up in this paper. That would kind of be, where I would point people to in order to kind of explain why you can't have these hard cutoffs or to say that, training to failure is better or training to failure is worse. And again, it really just comes down to uncertainty based on kind of what we have right now in the research. So to kind of work through some of the main concepts of the paper, and then we'll probably get into some more practical discussions by the end of this segment. From a high level, when we think of this body of research as a whole, it has some significant differences compared to other bodies of research with other training variables, right? So our typical training variables like training frequency, training volume, and intensity, or probably what's better termed as load, those are all very well defined, and we can kind of tangibly quantify them, right? We know how many times per week you're going into the gym and squatting, and we can actually like put a number on that, right? Whereas proximity to failure isn't, or at least not yet. And we'll circle back to that concept here in a little bit when we kind of get to the practical recommendations. And I think just in terms of like getting to that point where we can actually quantify it and thus have studies we can be more confident in the findings and being able to apply those findings, the first step there is to have a good actual anchor point. So in other words, we need to kind of agree on a definition of failure, or at least be clear what we're defining as that anchor point as, hey, this is what failure is, right? This is, and when we think of proximity to failure, we're basically thinking of how far away from that failure point we are. In order to quantify that, we need to know what that failure point is, right? So there's a specific section in the paper just talking about that concept in general, right? So I think in the paper we talk about momentary versus volitional failure. So momentary failure would be, actually attempting another repetition, and despite maximal effort to complete the repetition, you're unable to do so. Whereas volitional failure would be something like, hey, I'm very confident I couldn't get another rep, so I just racked the barbell, right? So those can be considerably different in practice when you think about the possibility that more repetitions are still in reserve with that volitional definition. Also, there might be reason to believe that the fatigue from momentary muscular failure is exponentially greater than like kind of that volitional definition. So again, there's lots of uncertainty there, but that's kind of the first step, is finding that anchor point. And probably even more of a concern, if you will, is that studies will kind of ambiguously just use the term failure, and they won't be very descriptive of that. And that can be interpreted in many different ways, right? Hey, we did 3 sets with a 10 RM load leading to failure. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean that every single set was taken to some sort of failure? Or does that mean that you just kind of adjusted the load so that final set was taken to failure, right? That's an important difference. And a lot of these studies informing, the meta-analyses we've recently had on proximity to failure have some of those kind of fundamental issues. So that's the first point, is we kind of need to define that anchor. But I'll pause there before moving on and see if, Zach, you have anything to kind of chime in.
Not really. The only thing I thought about when you kind of were opening a little bit is I do think proximity to failure is by far the variable that has the least clear definition. But I do think you could make some you could at least discuss probably volume and frequency having a little bit more difficult definitions than we all often describe as well. And the reason I bring this up is I think it just further compounds just issues with drawing any sort of conclusions to form firm recommendations like you're discussing with all this stuff. For example, volume load was extremely, common, I would say a little bit in older research. That's somewhat fallen out of favor to some degree now. And we generally, especially for hypertrophy oriented research, you're going to see, equating number of sets as something that's a little bit more common. Depending if you just see volume was equated in a paper and it's not specifically saying how that's done, it's a little bit difficult to know what they're describing there. And I think a similar thing could be done with frequency, whereas this one probably is a little bit less, up for interpretation, but you could have frequency per week per muscle group, but you could also have frequency per week per movement. And I think especially if you're in a strength oriented context, I think that's something that is important to kind of keep in mind. That's pretty much the only thing I had there.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think probably the fundamental difference is that, like, we've at least tried to quantify it, or we at least have tools to potentially quantify it. Those quantification methods have limitations, as you said, right? We know that if someone's benching 3 times a week and you add a 4th bench day compared to adding a 4th day in which they're doing like some cable chest flies, that's totally different in practice. But at least, again, we have some sort of way to quantify it. So totally agree. Okay, so next to kind of move on here, I think from a high level, there are multiple meta-analyses that have come out in the last couple of years indicating that failure versus non-failure, and as well as some meta-analyses looking at different set structures, which indirectly influence proximity to failure. So kind of often comparing like 2 non-failure protocols, they don't necessarily lead to different outcomes for strength and hypertrophy. I'd refer, for a little bit more details on those, I'd refer the listener to episode, I believe it's 19, where we discuss those more in depth. But again, the point I'm making is that from kind of the top of the hierarchy of evidence, if you will, those meta-analyses that we have, they don't seem to indicate that there's anything especially beneficial in terms of strength or hypertrophy to training to failure. And it also doesn't seem that, some of those set structure meta-analyses, those don't seem to necessarily drive the strength or hypertrophy response as well. But again, we can kind of acknowledge that, okay, that's at the top of the hierarchy of evidence, if you will. But if you kind of dive into some of the individual studies and we look at some of the discrepancies between studies, that can kind of, again, give us some insight into potentially like what's going on here, or at least just, again, getting some insight into how to improve this body of research in general. So like we kind of talk about in the paper how there are discrepancies between individual studies. And obviously that can be due to things like sampling error, but it could also be due, and we would hypothesize that it's at least in part due to poor quantification methods. So in other words, because a certain study favors training closer to failure, whereas another study favors training farther from failure, there's a lot of things that could be leading to that discrepancy, but it could, and we would guess that at least part of that is due to the fact that the way those 2 different labs approached those protocols are considerably different. And further, the fact that we don't have kind of a clear and consistent way to define that proximity to failure and to report it in the paper makes it hard to compare study to study, right? So ultimately, that's what we're kind of arguing for, is like we need to kind of iron this out, and that will lead us to making better practical conclusions in the future. So, for example, to kind of go through the different methods that have been used so far that inform those meta-analyses, a lot of them will use percentage-based protocols, and we know that that's going to lead to pretty imprecise proximity to failure. So we know that at a given percentage of 1 rep max, individuals are going to be able to perform a considerably different number of repetitions across individuals. So if you prescribe 4 sets of 10 at 75%, and the goal is for that to lead to failure, yes, some people might fail in that last set perfectly. Some people might fail in the first set though, and some people might finish the fourth set and have 6, 7, 8 RIR. Right. And often we're taking those percentage based prescriptions, looking at average reps performed and trying to estimate RIR, which might be okay on average. But again, it's not a very precise way of looking at this question of proximity to failure. Next, we'll have some studies using repetition maximum zones. So, for example, it'll say, hey, they did 3 sets of 10, 3 sets at 10 at a 10 RM. And again, I think I alluded to this before, and that's a little bit ambiguous, at least in the way it's often reported. Does that mean every single set is adjusted so that they think they'll fail on that final repetition, or is it failure on the last repetition? Again, it's just not totally clear when you dig into these studies. The next one I'll point out is velocity loss. And we've talked about velocity loss a good amount on the podcast, but there are some inherent kind of issues with how velocity loss influences proximity to failure. Again, on average, it's going to be a pretty good way to kind of look at this question. But for example, if we take a given velocity loss percentage and apply that at different percentages of 1 rep max, that's going to dramatically influence the number of repetitions in reserve. There's also factors such as set to set fatigue. So in other words, if you're on your final set of an exercise, but the velocity loss prescription is still the same, you're going to be, again, fatigued. Thus, the first rep velocity is probably going to be lower than it was in the first set. And thus, you're going to a lower absolute velocity at the end of that last set, ultimately leading to you being closer to failure. So again, it doesn't really control this variable of proximity to failure or RIR totally reliably. Okay. And then we do have a couple studies that actually use like subject reported repetitions in reserve. So one by Helms, I think that was his dissertation study, and then one from Graham and Cleather. These provide a little bit of insight on this question, but at the end of the day, they were really investigating reps in reserve versus fixed loading. So kind of like auto-regulated training versus non-auto-regulated training. So that's kind of where we're at right now. We have these studies that do have different proximities to failure, but not in the most precise way via these methods. Okay. So again, I'll pause there after kind of briefly going through each of the commonly used methods right now and see if you have anything just.
I really don't. It just got me thinking about one small tangent. I guess we can go on just for a little bit. One probably the most interesting line of a recent paper looking at kind of a review paper kind of discussing proximity to failure as well. The title of that paper is Intensity of Effort and Momentary Failure in Resistance Training. Are we asking a binary question for a continuous variable? One of the most interesting lines out of this paper is basically talking about the authors reanalyzed a large meta-analysis that compared the effects for strength and hypertrophy of previously untrained individuals in comparison to non-training controls. So just let that sink in for a second. Untrained individuals, and you're training these people, and then you're comparing that to untrained controls. The effect sizes were 0.88 and 0.37 for strength and hypertrophy respectively. So what that means is we're kind of barely crossing, large and moderate effects for strength and hypertrophy respectively for comparing resistance training to people not doing any training at all. So the reason I think that's relevant is kind of when we're asking this question in general, it's important to kind of think about what is the magnitude of difference between these things that we care about. Again, this is somewhat of a tangent, but it's just something I think is interesting to think about, because we have these meta-analyses that I think at face value we would kind of say, hey, there doesn't really seem to be a large difference here. But if we're comparing untrained people training to people that are just untrained controls that don't do any training at all, and we're only seeing those magnitude of effects, man, it starts to make you think that maybe these smaller point estimates of the effect between failure and non-failure, or some difference in proximity to failure. It's just something to think about, and just another variable to layer on to all the uncertainty in the methods that Josh talked about. Is like not only are the methodologies that we utilize for all these studies in some cases unclear, and in many cases not able to actually isolate the variable that we're trying to tease out the effect from, the effects that we're looking for are probably really small. So in order to actually be able to tease that out with any confidence, our methods need to be really tight, really controlled, and so that we can pick up these smaller effects, in addition to just the general constraints of exercise science research in general: small sample sizes, short durations of studies, the training status may not be the exact same that we're trying to generalize the finding to, all that stuff. So I don't know. I just think that's an interesting point to think about, but it is a small tangent. So I don't know if that is even relevant. It's something you want to entertain, Josh, but we can keep going if not. But it's just something I thought about when you brought up the meta-analyses.
I don't think that's a tangent at all, because I think that totally aligns with exactly what we're talking about in this podcast and also in the paper. Of like, yeah, we can look at this in general with broad brushstrokes, and we're not seeing a difference yet, or at least not a convincing one across the entire body of literature. But and we talked about this in the last podcast episode, like this variable of proximity to failure, like it's probably not going to, it's not going to like make or break outcomes in these study designs we typically see in exercise science, but it can make it might make enough of a difference that if you have like a late stage intermediate who's plateaued, that understanding these small effects can be the difference of continuing to plateau versus kind of breaking through that and starting to see tangible
This brings
progress.
up another small tangent, but it's just something I think that this is another like really practical thing that I'd like to see that I don't think often is discussed. So we have all of these small things in research that we kind of talk about that seem to provide neutral to positive effects, right? And the effect sizes are usually going to be pretty small, but this is one of those examples. Let's say the directionality, I'm not exactly sure, but let's just say training to failure was slightly better than non-failure. But the difference was kind of negligible, to the sense that if somebody looked at it, they'd be like, training to failure is kind of uncomfortable. I don't want to do it. That doesn't really seem like it's worth it. One thing I'd like to see is like if we took like just like a very, very basic program that has, progressive overload, and probably that's about it. You want to do anything else really fancy. Maybe it's just, the same protocol with like double progression or whatever, in comparison to like trying to stack all of these really small effects on top of one another, and just see how much of a difference that makes if we take all these very minuscule things and try to put them all together. Like maybe one person's at the very bottom of the protein range, the other one is at the maximum end of the protein range. They're training, maybe in a slightly better periodized design, maybe a little more volume, like just all those things that we kind of talk about as neutral to positive effect, probably not a bad idea. And like, does that actually make a difference? Like, that's just a curiosity question that I have, like trying to take like the concoction of evidence-based recommendations versus something that's way more standard, to see if actually these neutral to positive effects can kind of stack on top of one another and actually lead to like pretty meaningful differences in outcomes. Because I think it's easy to like isolate those and be like, this doesn't really matter. But there's a potential that those things could stack on top of one another and be a pretty big difference if you like were to carry that out over the course of a year. Now, obviously that study's likely not to be done, but it's interesting nonetheless. And I think proximity to failure is like one of those things, like you were saying, Josh, that, you apply this in the context of an individual, especially when there's a lot more moving parts that can happen in practice. I think that's where this variable really starts to slightly separate itself from the research and the constraints that we can look at it there and how we apply it in practice. But yeah.
No, I totally agree. I think at the end of the day, like anybody that's listening to this podcast probably cares about small effects, and that's kind of what we're after. And we'd be the first to acknowledge that any effect within a reasonable range of varying proximities to failure is probably going to be a small effect. But if we can have better quantification methods, and more precise control over it, and we can thus detect that effect, then okay, now we can apply that small difference. And again, those are the things that might add up over the course of 2, 3, 4 training years, but in these study designs might not show up unless you're very, very precise with your methods. So again, totally agree. And it makes me excited for the future because I know there's room for improvement specifically in this area. It's not to like say anything negatively by any means about any of the work that has been done, but instead just to say that like, hey, we've learned a lot about this. We have some very good, you know, or some decent practical recommendations, or some good conceptualization of this topic. But like, who knows? Maybe 10 years from now, we're like, hey, we're completely wrong about some of the ways we applied this, or this meta-analysis that came out in 2021 or 2022 or whatever. Now that we have these better quantification methods, the script has been flipped, right?
Yeah,
So,
this has just
anyway.
like been my thing as of recently. It is just like, I think it's really easy to take the average effects that we look at and then apply those recommendations to individuals. Like I know what Greg Knuckles recently talked about this in one of his mass articles, is one of the reasons I really started thinking about this, and just all the areas this applies, in the sense that we often take these recommendations, just like we said, that on average doesn't seem to be a large effect. But that doesn't mean this isn't a really large effect on an individual level. Like I think from a coaching experience, I've seen that a few times in both directions, right? Like we talk about this low fatigue stuff for strength, especially, and how that kind of influences our stock standard training approach, right? But I think in both directions, at least for me, I've had people that I take to the extreme of, maybe this person is doing like 10 sets of 3 at like 80%, like pretty often, and a lot of the time, even in like more hypertrophy dominant phases, versus somebody else that like, even in like a strength phase that I would generally advocate for lower intraset fatigue, maybe they're doing, sets of 8 at an 8 RPE because for whatever reason for them, it just seems to be super helpful. And I think like just the proximity to failure research at large, I think there's a lot left to be done on that level. Like there's anecdotes from both sides of like people who do like get into powerlifting, let's say, start more of like a sub-maximal program. I think that's a little bit more common in powerlifting. And they might even increase muscle size, although that's like not the standard recommendation to be doing like a bunch of volume with quite a few reps in reserve. Now, the other end of the spectrum also exists, people that do really low volume programs and take a bunch of sets to momentary failure on all exercises. Like those anecdotes also exist. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that there could just be some physiological factors we're simply not able to measure or be aware of at the moment that could influence us on an individual level, that there maybe is pretty strong effects for a specific person favoring one modality versus the other that we just simply haven't had the time nor tools to investigate adequately quite yet.
Yeah, so what you're saying is, okay, we improved quantification methods and then we're actually able to detect this small effect, but this effect might be the complete opposite for you.
Much.
So yeah, there's your take home. We're never going to have an answer for you. Okay, so that actually, I think that leads nicely into the next point, which is which is about, okay, we have like some of these discrepancies in terms of individual studies and kind of which way they lean, right? But then we actually think about what's leading to those discrepancies. One of them might be quantification methods, which I think is definitely a factor at play. Another are other training variables, because at the end of the day, proximity to failure in practice is not going to operate in isolation. If you're going to generally take an approach in which your proximity to failure is greater, so you're training further from failure, you're probably going to be on a higher volume approach in general. Or if your preferences are to train closer to failure, you're probably going to train with lower volumes, right? So again, this variable does not operate independently in practice. So we can kind of look at these individual studies and again see which way they lean and potentially get some insights. So I think a good example of this are two studies. One is from Santaniello and colleagues. This one compared training to momentary failure versus volitional failure. And I'm actually pretty confident in the volitional failure in this study because it was a within subjects design. So one leg, they were consistently training all the way to failure. If you complete a rep, you got to go for the next one type of thing. Whereas the other leg within that same individual, they just said, hey, stop when you basically think you have 0 reps in reserve, right? So this one, they used previous training volumes from the individuals, increased them by 20%. And what they report is that on average, individuals were doing 20 plus sets per leg. So on the higher end of the volume spectrum within these kind of studies, looking at different proximities to failure. This one had a small effect size leaning in favor of a non-failure. So kind of like that 0 RAR group, right? So again, we see how, okay, generally a higher volume program, we saw that they didn't benefit from making dang sure every single set was to failure and staying slightly shy of it. Okay. Another good example on the other side of the spectrum is a study from Carson and colleagues. This one leaned in favor of training to failure, but these individuals only trained 1 time per week, right? So again, we see how, okay, lower volume, lower frequency, that might, you might be able to take advantage of training to failure, probably getting like a greater magnitude of stimulus.
Just to be clear on the Carson study, it wasn't a 1 time a week training, like session wise. It was, they trained 2 times a week, and some muscle groups had 1 time a week frequency. So they did train 2 times a week, I believe, like the number of sessions, but the frequency per the muscle group that favored the group training to failure, particularly the quads, if I remember correctly, that was only being trained once a week.
Yeah, it was, they trained the squat, they trained the back squat 1 time per week with 4 sets to failure. And then they compared that to 8 sets of 5 at a 10 rep max load. And the vastus lateralis muscle thickness kind of, again, lean in favor of that group training with 4 sets to failure as opposed to 8 sets of 5 with the 10 rep max load. So yeah, it's a good point. Specifically,
the reason I bring that up is because I think another huge thing that I haven't seen discussed too much that I think is pretty important here is like when people train in the real world, they train all muscle groups. And in a lot of these studies, they are manipulating literally 1 exercise. Now, sometimes it's unclear whether they're allowed to do other training, they're allowed to, whatever they're allowed to do outside the study. But from an experimental perspective, sometimes it's literally 1 exercise. And that probably has, limitations, obviously, because if I have a session where I literally only do squats versus a session where I do squats, maybe some bench press afterwards, maybe some back work, and maybe I finish up with some arms of some kind, that's going to have some different implications for overall adaptation. Of course, just being considerably more fatigued from that first exercise, from a practical perspective, at least anecdotally, I feel like that's definitely going to have something you at least want to consider. So I think it's just interesting to think about all the different like cross lines that aren't controlled, properly here that we've already discussed at length already, but it's hard to separate a lot of these factors.
Yeah. So I kind of gave an example of a study on the higher end of the spectrum in terms of volume, and then a study on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of volume. But if we do think of these studies as a whole overall, they generally lean lower volume compared to what I think most people would do in practice. So a lot of the research that does inform, kind of the general proximity to failure consensus in terms of the research right now are those velocity loss studies. And to my knowledge, the vast majority of them trained with less than 10 sets per week on the exercises they train, right? So, and generally speaking, I think we can be fairly confident that those studies suggest that not training with a very high velocity loss is that's going to be disadvantageous for strength. I think you can pretty reasonably make that conclusion. And I would also say that those indicate that you can observe robust hypertrophy without training with very high velocity losses. Again, that will lead to failure, right? And then you layer in the fact that a lot of these studies are generally lower volume. Okay, we might actually be able to be more confident in that, in the sense of, okay, if we kind of think of this relationship between higher training volumes in practice, or you might thus stay further from failure on average. Okay, that can make us a little bit more confident in applying these principles in practice. Again, still lots of limitations here. You could bring up training status of the subjects. You could bring up the fact that in order to probably better control velocity loss, they use Smith machine squats, which might have downstream implications compared to barbell squats. Lots of different things to consider. But again, I think the take home here, based on Zach's point about overall training workload, just based on, hey, these studies will typically only do a couple exercises, versus in addition to the fact that even in the exercises they are training, they're a little bit lower volume than what we see in practice. Again, that might influence how we apply these concepts and integrate them into practice with total body training and probably higher volume for each muscle group. All right, and then to kind of wrap up this discussion of the paper, I think the last thing to take note of is, in addition to the quantification methods and some of the limitations of how proximity to failure is actually controlled, we also have to think about some of the limitations of the measurements in terms of the outcomes, right? So if we specifically think about hypertrophy, a lot of these studies will only look at one specific site on one muscle group. So in other words, you might look at muscle thickness 50% of the way down the upper leg on the vastus lateralis, and kind of use that as your measure of comparing hypertrophy outcomes between two groups training at different proximities to failure. However, in practice, I think there's pretty good reason to believe that we can see like a varying response in terms of hypertrophy along the length of a given muscle, as well as potentially different outcomes in terms of synergist muscles. So this is like the glutes in the squat, the triceps in the bench press, that kind of thing, right? And a lot of these studies don't take all of those measurements as well, which isn't necessarily that doesn't completely nullify the findings or anything like that, but it's just another consideration if you're going for max efficiency, right? And just in terms of applying these general concepts to practice, because if you're training the squat, you're probably hoping for hypertrophy of the quadriceps throughout the entire muscle group, as well as the glutes, right? As opposed to, hey, I'm just trying to maximize hypertrophy at this one site on one muscle, right? So that's another consideration as well, just in terms of answering this question more thoroughly going forward in the research.
Yeah, really the only thing I have to add to that is this is like a big thing. I think exercise selection matters a ton. Like if you're fatiguing your quads in a free weight squat, the reason that may not show up in the research may not be necessarily because of the relationship between proximity to failure and muscle growth. It just may be due to the biomechanics of the exercise. So like you just think about it, like the load that you have on your quads in a leg press as you get closer to failure, it really can't go anywhere. Like you can't really change your mechanics too much on a leg press because you're in a fixed path. But your body's natural way of like trying to complete a task is trying to shift the loading demands in a way that allows you to complete the task. And if you are fatiguing your quads intentionally when you're squatting, it's going to try to distribute that load to other places. Now, obviously, we can try to consciously avoid this with our technique, but to some degree that's always going to happen in a free weight movement, just because that's how you're going to self-organize under the influence of fatigue. So I think that's something to think about too, which is like a perfectly falls in line with what Josh is saying. Like if we're only looking at like the prime mover muscles in these studies where we have squats 4 sets of 10 at 75% of 1RM versus 8 sets of 5, so one group is considerably farther from failure than the other, and we only measure quad hypertrophy, maybe that's not going to tell us the entire story, because if you're squatting under high fatigue, you're likely going to turn it into somewhat of a good morning, which theoretically may put more of the load in your hip extensors rather than your legs. And so maybe the total muscle growth is slightly different there if we look at all the muscle groups involved, to which maybe that slightly changes the conclusions we make. Maybe training farther from failure spares fatigue, and you're able to have a more targeted stimulus. Whereas training closer to failure, which I think is anecdotally what people kind of find, is that it's just going to have kind of a shotgun approach where you're going to get the most stimulus because it's going to potentially train more tissue at that closer relevant proximity to failure. That seems to be, at least there seems to be some sort of threshold there, even though we aren't able to quantify it accurately. So yeah, that's just something I think is relevant.
Yeah, and if I'm kind of following your line of thinking properly, and let me know if not. And I think this conclusion, or this, I should say, hypothesis lines up with practice pretty well, that potentially with more free weight type exercises, again, if you're thinking of the prime mover, you might be able to, I guess, get away with training further from failure, in the sense that, like, hey, if you're 5 RAR on a back squat, your quads might be pretty dang, close to failure, if you will. Whereas, you still have a good amount of like technique shifting that can still occur later in the set that would potentially lead to greater growth of some synergist muscles, like the glutes in this case, right? So again, that seems to kind of align with practice, in the sense of, like, I would be more likely to prescribe training further from failure with like a deadlift or a squat or a bench press compared to like a hack squat. But I'm not sure
Yeah,
if
I mean,
that
I
totally
probably
aligns
not
with what you're
articulate it
saying.
perfectly, but like one thing I do wonder is like, so yes, I agree with the current research that we have. Like the stimulus from the set for like the prime movers of a free weight exercise probably seems to be maximized a little bit farther from failure than most people think. But I do wonder if, like, you would have to be able to investigate somehow if there is a true advantage of taking that muscle to, like, if there's like a theoretical failure point
Mm.
that's farther down. Exactly.
Without
Yeah, right. It's
constraints.
like,
You can kind of
yeah,
make the argument both ways. You can make the argument I just made, but you could also make the argument that, hey, in a squat, that's just
yeah,
going to be worse overall, because you're not locked in like you are in a hack squat. But maybe there is something magical once you do, kind of take yourself very close or to failure within the constraints, where your knee flexion is locked in because it's a machine based exercise. Those two possibilities are very
exactly.
much on the table. And again, I think
Yeah,
you can make
yeah,
both arguments.
exactly.
Is
Like
that
there
is that
could
more
be
aligned with
like
what you're saying?
a deeper
Yeah.
degree of fatigue or deeper degree of stimulus able to be achieved if you are in a locked path and you're just able to put those reps that are really close to failure only in your quads, for example. Like, um, I still need to think about how
Yeah.
to like perfectly articulate that, but yeah, I think there could be differences as far as like, yeah, leg press versus squat and those kind of things.
Yeah. And I think when you think of like proximity to failure as a cost benefit analysis as well, the quote unquote cost is primarily going to be like the fatigue that comes from proximity to failure, and thus the downstream effects that has on your overall training program. Anecdotally, the cost of pushing a more machine based locked in exercise closer to failure is going to be less than that of a free weight exercise. Um, so thus you might have kind of a couple points in favor of that. But again, like, it's just uncertainty, right? Like we don't know the answer. I think you can make reasonable arguments both ways, and again, that's something that I think still needs to be hashed out. With
The
that,
only thing I was going to add is
go
like, I
for it,
think
Zach.
one of the reasons that's the case is because like when you're training a leg press or a squat like close to failure, you're probably intending to have like fatigue in your legs the way that you're setting up your training program. But where some of the cons probably come in is like multi-joint exercises where you're taking close to failure, you're getting a lot of shifting of the loading demands, and you're potentially fatiguing other muscle groups and potentially like joints and connective tissue and stuff like that, that you're not necessarily training on that day, if that makes sense, in like quotes. And then that kind of bleeds over into other sessions that maybe you're trying to hit those muscle groups more directly. And it just kind of turns into a snowball potentially where, yeah, it's just like not as well accounted for. Whereas like taking a leg press close to failure, my quads are going to be zapped and potentially for the next few days. But most likely in the way that you design your training, you're not going to train your quads the next day or the day after that if you're really trying to smoke them. So yeah, it's just something
Yeah,
else. But yeah.
cool. All right, last thing to kind of talk about on this paper, and I'll keep this brief because it's probably best or easiest to conceptualize if you actually pull up the paper and kind of look at this section here. Is in terms of, hey, what's the solution to this? So you guys talked about the problems and the uncertainty in depth. Well, what's the solution? So basically, what we argue is that in both research and practice is the RAR ACV relationship. So the repetitions in reserve, kind of assigning an average concentric velocity for each movement at each RAR. There's pretty good research that is constant across, kind of like that 65 to 85% of 1RM range. Beyond that, we kind of need a little bit more data, but it seems like probably our best option at this time. And again, if you pull up the paper, you can kind of read through the exact steps of how to do that in practice, and also that would apply for research as well. So, even if you're not super interested in like research methods, I think if you kind of look near the end of this paper, there's a section 7. It's called Recommendations for Researchers and Practitioners. There's some good stuff there that can be pretty tangible. And I think this is, a lot more people have started to pick up on this concept, and just anecdotally in training, it can go a long way for keeping you honest with RAR ratings and controlling it pretty tightly. All right, with that, Zach, unless you have anything to add, we can finally move on to the second segment of this podcast. And so Zach has some kind of like coaching observations or case studies that he's observed related to identifying strength limiters in lifters, and kind of how we've changed our minds on this probably over the last handful of months.
So I think the way I want to frame this is just kind of like going through the way that we've kind of thought about programming for strength and maybe kind of where we're at now. So I think we've always kind of identified ourselves with like a pretty muscle-centric view of training for strength. Now, obviously, there's advantages, disadvantages to doing that, but on average, I think we have our reasons for kind of viewing things that way. But we'll save the details of that for another podcast. But ultimately, what that kind of leads us to focusing on is, okay, obviously we need to practice the lifts enough, get exposures to heavy loads, to really have really specific exposures to doing so, but also that may come with some neuromuscular adaptations that are important for 1RM strength. But ultimately, if we think the biggest contributor to long-term development and strength is muscle size, that's kind of what a lot of the training is going to be dedicated towards. And so initially, I think the way that we viewed this question was like, okay, we have the way that the lifts are performed, and on average, here are the prime movers of the squat. Here are the prime movers of the bench press. Here are the prime movers of the deadlift. And I think those are perfectly reasonable like ways of thinking about things. And in the vast majority of cases, that's going to cover you. But I think one thing we've had recently that like, as we've gotten more coaching experience, and also this is one of the huge benefits of, from our perspective, at least from DDSIP, is just having such a much larger sample size and kind of watching the observations of a lot more people, and being able to kind of have an ear to the ground as far as like how some of those people are doing with their training, modifications they're making, things that are going well, things that are going poorly and such. And ultimately, like one thing I've really started to lean in towards more and more, and kind of have started to connect some anecdotes, is just this concept of like how different somebody's strength limiter can be. And I think that's a pretty basic concept at face value, but like I'll try to paint why I think this is so important, especially as you get more advanced. So let's take a novice lifter, right? Novice lifter, they do pretty general training. They do a good exposure to the competition lifts, but they have quite a bit of hypertrophy work in a bunch of different exercises. Because their recovery capacity in reference to like the stress per set that they can utilize, because they're not lifting as heavy absolute loads, those kind of things. This is somewhat anecdotally kind of driven, but this is just kind of the way that I've thought about it recently. The capacity for training for them is going to be wider than the stimulus needed to actually get them to move forward. And because of that, they can kind of have this shotgun approach, and is definitely going to push their limiter to allow them to progress strength. So what that means is, they're a novice lifter, maybe their quads are what are limiting their squat. It doesn't really matter what they do, because that is going to reach a sufficient stimulus to increase the size and ultimately force capacity of their quads. which will be translated into the movement and allow them to progress. This is why you often see people have the anecdote of novices can pretty much do anything and progress. And that's because I think you can really do pretty much anything that's remotely specific to the movement and allow you to attack the limiter for that individual. Now, let's shift to somebody that's a little bit more intermediate. That capacity relative to the stimulus they need to progress is going to narrow those margins a little bit, meaning they don't have as much recovery capacity in reserve to miss the mark on the training that they're doing to attack their limiter. Meaning, okay, if they continue to take this shotgun approach, maybe they're starting to outstrip their recovery capacity a little bit too much, and now they're not delivering as targeted of a stimulus to the actual limiter to see that thing budge in any reasonable amount of time. So let's say they continue to apply this somewhat suboptimal training approach. If you do that for long enough, you'll probably accumulate enough training attacking the limiter to see that budge upwards and eventually see some strength gains. That's just going to take a really long time if you're not efficiently attacking what is holding you back. So revisiting the example of our quads, let's say you're doing an intermediate lifter is still doing a bunch of competition squats, and maybe they're doing some belt squats, and that's kind of the majority of their squat training. But they're a pretty hip dominant squatter to the degree that that can happen. They don't feel a super strong stimulus in their quads from their competition squat, and the way that they perform their belt squat, maybe they put a bunch of bands on it. It's really challenging in a contracted position, and it's pretty hippie in the way that they execute it. That is a lot of work that potentially could train their quads to some degree, but because that's not very directed, that's a bunch of work that's pretty fatiguing, but also not directly attacking their limiter. Over time, that's still going to probably deliver a sufficient stimulus to the quads to see a little bump in their squat, but that's just going to take way, way longer than if they were to really dedicate that training to the actual limiter that's holding them back. And so this is where I think you get to the last kind of piece of this in an advanced lifter, where their recovery capacity essentially has no margin. You have to attack the limiter that is holding them back to see any meaningful progression in their total in a reasonable amount of time. Once again, if they did the competition lift for 5 years straight and they were able to tolerate that and not get hurt, you might be able to see a little bit of progress because that's more of that shotgun approach. But if we're looking to progress somebody's total in 12 weeks and they're an advanced lifter, this is where I think understanding strength levers becomes absolutely vital. Because in order to see that thing bump, in order to see the lift bump, the total bump, we need to target what we're doing specifically to what's holding them back. And so the anecdotes that I was kind of starting to think about that at least seem to support this from the trenches to me is this is where I think you get anecdotes from different exercises that people really find effective for them. This is where I think you get potentially even different loading ranges, proximities of failure that we just talked about. Let's go to the example of a squat and somebody whose quads hold them back. Potentially, if they're doing like a 10 sets of 3 approach at a moderate to heavy load, but it's pretty far from failure, they're going to be able to stay in their knees for a lot of those squats. And that may be a more efficient mechanism to deliver hypertrophy for that individual than taking a bunch of sets of squats close to failure, where more of those repetitions kind of turn into a good morning. That's an example, or one of these training variables. You could have a very strong individual anecdote. Similarly to that, you have somebody's bench press potentially is more limited by their shoulders and their triceps in comparison to their pecs. Now, I'm not saying the pecs aren't important. They are. It's just the relative kind of strengths and weaknesses of an individual that may result in them finding things like benching with accommodating resistance, benching with a closer grip, board presses, all those things where people generally have this really strong stance either for or against. I think the reason those camps kind of come into existence is because you find these groups of people who, based on their biomechanics, maybe physiology that we don't understand yet, kind of have these very set strength limiters that just are different. And that ultimately results in different things becoming effective. A third example is there's been a little bit of research looking at, the EMG for pecs. That seems to be maximized at relatively lower loads. And if you find somebody who's limited by their pecs, and instead of doing a bunch of heavy bench work, maybe there's one of those people that have found doing sets of 20 on touch and go bench to be really effective for them, and things like that. I ultimately think that's where all these anecdotes kind of align. And the reason I think this is significant is, again, from our perspective, this really boils down to kind of like a muscle centric equation. Muscles produce force. There's a necessary amount of force to lift the mass, and that's ultimately the sport and the things that we're trying to optimize for. But it gets complicated when we think about the ways in which we need to attack a given muscle group or a given strength limiter to ultimately make that happen. But what I think understanding at least this theoretical model that may be completely wrong, but at least the way that I've been thinking about it recently, it allows you to be more efficient in the way that you're searching for solutions to these problems rather than looking for a magic exercise or rather than looking for a magic protocol for an individual. We've talked about kind of the individualization research and individual response a lot. What I think it is ultimately for is you're just trying to find first and foremost, the strength limiter of an individual, and then you're trying to find a efficient means of attacking that limiter for somebody. So a simple example, maybe for somebody, a bench press just really doesn't attack their pecs very much. So just doing a bunch of bench volume because you're trying to get their bench to progress may not be the right answer. You're going to get some people where the competition lift and their limiter seem to align pretty well, to which a more specific program, that maybe is where that anecdote comes from. Whereas somebody else, maybe the competition lift is in stark contrast to the limiter that they're trying to progress. And that's where maybe some of these way more varied programs and the anecdotes come from. So I think that's where you kind of start to see this stuff. And I think the last thing that I think from a practical perspective kind of becomes even more important from a coach's view is that including really, pretty heavy sets and sets close to failure, I think become even more important, at least at some regular interval, because it allows you to better diagnose these limiters, in my opinion. Taking a look at a lift to which you are really coming close to your maximal capacity, whether that be because the load is near maximal or you're taking a set pretty much all the way to failure, that usually is going to help you identify the limiter better than just kind of taking a guess. So yeah, that was a long rant, Josh. What do you think? What am I missing?
No, I think that was really well put. And like you said, we kind of started at the position of, hey, let's focus on what the prime movers are on average, and really hammer those. And I still think that's probably a good starting point, and we'll probably cover the majority of people. But I think where you run into individuals that, hey, that I've been doing that for 6-12 months, it's not working. This is probably the next step. See if you can identify, which specific joints are kind of the issue. At the end of the day, you're not able to, for a maximal repetition, ideally with a heavy load. So we're talking like singles, doubles, triples at like 9.5 to 10, right? Then you can really start to elucidate, okay, where am I kind of shifting the loading demands, and what does that tell me about what joint isn't producing enough torque in order to ultimately, overcome the loading demands and complete the repetition. So like, I know over the last month or two, if we're kind of trying to do this for a client, Zach and I will just send each other videos of those heavy sets and say like, hey, here's what I'm seeing. What do you think? And we'll kind of go back and forth, because kind of identifying those is a whole nother beast in and of itself that we're still trying to kind of conceptualize and get better at. So we'll probably avoid talking about the specifics of that. I'll throw out a quick case study. I didn't ask my client about kind of talking about this ahead of time, so I'm gonna keep them anonymous. But I've been working with a client for like 4-ish months now, and just from looking at like his previous 1RMs, it was pretty dang clear that his knees were having absolutely no issue overcoming the torque demands, and his hips were clearly like the limiter, and I was very confident in that, and thus for that reason I'm having him only squat twice a week, and all of his volume is just on the main lift. So in other words, like basically we're just practicing, probably get some quad stimulus, no problem, but then for all lower body accessory work beyond like pretty specific squat volume, pretty specific deadlift volume, is basically all pushed towards the hip extensors, the glutes and the hamstrings. So things like a really well executed RDL to the floor, things like long stride dumbbell lunges. And so far, I mean, obviously there's a lot of factors that can be at play to kind of lead to progress, but we have seen like very, very incredible progress. Like on his deadlift, his previous PR was 205 kilos. He just hit 240 for a triple. And then on squat, he is and he also just finished up a cut. So mind you, these numbers are at like, I want to say like 5 kilos lower body weight. He just tripled his old one rep max, or I think it might have been 2.5 above his old one rep max. So again, kind of identifying those limiters seem to go a long way. There might be a little bit of confirmation bias here, but we're continuing to refine this process because it's something we've come around to, and I think I'm pretty confident saying it's something we've changed our mind on. So yeah, that's can hopefully put a bow on that. I just think I'm becoming more and more convinced of the importance of it.
Like another quick anecdote that I've had is I've had a few clients, another extremely polarizing topic you'll hear in the powerlifting world is, do the shoulders and or does OHP contribute to bench press? And you'll get a lot of the more IPF USAPL guys that pretty high arch bench say it's literally just a waste of time. And I'm not, in my experience, I don't think there's been a ton of carryover for most people. And I think you can make a pretty strong biomechanics rationale for why that's the case. But I've had a few clients where for whatever reason we just and like Josh said, there's some kind of movement analysis we can do to try to tease these things apart, but we're by no means saying that we're experts at that. But that, in addition to just some of my clients just saying like, hey man, my shoulders feel weak, we can throw some things in there that theoretically attack that more, whether that's some overhead pressing, shoulder pressing, or very high incline pressing. And anecdotally, that's some people whose benches has been extremely stubborn have just really taken off. And the final piece of this is like,
yep.
You look across social media and you'll see these really well trained guys, and one thing I could just never reconcile from my coaching experience is that, man, how are they making like week to week progress or just progress at a relatively reasonable interval when they're like world level competitors? Like that just didn't seem to jive with me. And I think that, in addition to our consistent anecdote that we've mentioned on the podcast a lot of like streaky progression, I think one thing that could be is like you just have correctly identified your limiter and have accumulated enough time attacking that man, that's where the streak comes from. Is like, yep. We frequently will kind of rotate exercises in and out for adherence reasons, for different reasons like that. And potentially you just get one that an athlete, hits their limiter perfectly for whatever reason, based on the way they execute it, based on the exact machine that they have or whatever. And then that is also happening within a permissive environment for progress, which we also talk about being very important: nutrition, sleep, stress, all that kind of stuff. Both those factors kind of come together. You are correctly attacking the limiter in your training for an individual. You have a permissive environment, and you've been doing so for enough time for that kind of to manifest into meaningful results of progress. And dang, that's where the streak comes from. And I think that's where like it can happen on a faster time scale, because if you think about it, something is holding your 1RM back, something. And it's very clear, like one thing is going to be limiting your ability to complete that repetition. If we are able to budge that at all, theoretically, your 1RM should improve. So it's just really about trying to make sure that we can identify that appropriately. And I think that can result in these streaks that we're kind of always talking about, like why do these manifest? And I think that could be at least one reason.
Yeah, I think I agree. I would just like, obviously, like the examples we gave. So like I gave the anecdote of my client. You gave like the anecdote of giving someone some like long range of motion, high incline bench, as kind of a way to address the limiter of their shoulders, right? Like those are very clean cut examples that are easy to explain, and that like anecdotes kind of like
For
lead
sure.
to the discussion of outliers often. So like it's often not like that clear cut and that obvious, right? Like for example, I was looking at a client who had a bench press that is like a 1RM that they failed, and I was trying to figure out, like I was trying to make my best guess as to the limiter, but there's other factors that lead to missing the lift. It's like I think you kind of
That's a
just
really
jumped the
good
bar
point.
here, and it was more
Yeah.
of a technique thing. And like yeah, who's to say that like if you were to take that like theoretically in a parallel universe 10 times, you wouldn't have hit it 8 times, and it was just because you kind of made that technique fault and that
Yep.
you touched half an inch lower on your chest, right? So like we're it's tough because you're trying to be very targeted, but you might like select
Yes.
somewhere to target, but that's wrong. So ultimately, as coaches, our job is to try to get better at identifying that. And then there's also the factor of like, hey, it might not actually be a muscular thing, right? And okay, like maybe it's not a muscular thing and it's more of like a technique or confidence or just kind of aligning the tapering strategy so that it leads to the ability to truly express strength, right? Those are all factors as well. Then you get to the fact, okay, it is maybe a muscular thing, but for this individual, they've been training for 20 years and they're weight class restricted, and there's additional life context factors that might not lead it to see meaningful hypertrophy, right? There's all these different things. So even though this can be a helpful mental model, I don't want to
Yeah,
make it like
it's
a pipe
funny you say
dream.
that.
You know what I
I
mean? I
should
don't
have
want to
said all
make
these
it.
things on the front end because I also view those as limiters, if that makes sense. Like it's kind of like this flow chart in my mind. Um, all the
Yeah.
things we just discussed, which I should have stated to be clear, are kind of under the assumption that you've done your basic initial checklist of like, okay, I think the first and foremost thing is like all the psychological factors you mentioned and like any very extraneous lifestyle factors of like when you're assessing somebody's performance. Like those are absolutely number one before you kind of go to some of the other things, confidence, just general well-being and like understanding of like an athlete's psychology. After that is absolutely technical factors. Like there are execution things that you could just purely be cueing wrong in your mind or not having fully you know mastered a given technical execution that can very very easily blur the lines here and make it more difficult to understand. So those two things definitely I think need to be kind of taken into account first. So these are kind of under the assumption, and to be clear, this is why maybe one of the reasons I didn't mention this is because I think it's a less consequential in the situations where that's most likely to be the case. For beginner and intermediate lifters, where those factors likely aren't completely drilled down all the way yet, maybe they're still kind of getting their confidence, maybe they're still kind of getting exposure to lifting near maximal loads, and they're still kind of figuring out some of their technical things. You don't have to be as on the nose. Like a more shotgun approach is still going to result in you attacking your limiter enough with sufficient stimulus to be able to kind of move the needle. So like that's I think it kind of goes in line with all these things. And then the final example you brought up, Josh, I think that's where it becomes vital. Is the example you're saying is like somebody whose recovery capacity is limited, their weight class restricted, all these things. That's in my mind, that's like where it's absolutely vital because we want to spend all of our time and energy directed towards the thing that's actually going to result in progress and literally nothing in the areas that it won't. And so I think that's really important. But then the last thing Josh said that I think is also super crucial to say is like some examples are really clear cut. And the max is a clean max. There wasn't a ton of like wobbling and all those kind of things. And oh, okay, this I'm pretty confident this is the direction we should at least try. In other examples, somebody's technique is like really balanced and there's not like a ton of shifting of loading demands. And maybe there's some other just technical things that make it really hard to kind of evaluate. So it's not always a clear cut decision. But the point being, I think it's helpful from a mental model perspective to say, like, okay, this training block, this training cycle, whatever, we're going to try to move the needle on this specific thing, see if it correlates to increases in your strength or whatever, and see where that goes. But yeah, there absolutely are limitations to viewing things in this way. And that's why I try to kind of state our muscle centric bias on the front end, because that's just the way that we think it, for the most part, makes sense to view things. But there absolutely are limitations of viewing things that way. Like there could be structural, adaptations to the tendons and connective tissue that we're not totally accounting for with this kind of mind of thinking. And maybe we're not paying enough attention to the neural adaptations that could happen, those kind of things. But the other thing I was going to say is that I also think that targeting a lot of the training towards like a perceived muscular limiter gives you a little bit more flexibility with some of like the skill oriented work to focus really hard on a technical issue that you may perceive, as opposed to like trying to kill two birds with one stone, if that makes sense. Like you may prescribe a close grip bench to kind of work on some technique issue, but also kind of be a good stimulus for hypertrophy. If we're a little bit more targeted with our approach, it potentially can allow you to like kind of bifurcate those a little bit more and really focus on, okay, what technical issues does this individual have? And then we can like try to, with the other work that we're doing, really attack the potential muscle group we think is limiting your performance. But yeah, that's pretty much the thing that to highlight from all that is this is a limited model, has limitations. It's where we're at right now. Probably is going to change because it changed to get here, and you know, there's still a degree of the art of coaching that goes into all of this. Like it's not something we have a PubMed link for. It's just kind of trying to mold anecdotes from ourselves, from other people, things we've seen, things we've observed, along with some of the evidence that we have, and try to come up with a cohesive decision-making process to try to eliminate some of the biases in decision-making that we have as coaches, to try to like an easy example that I always come back to for this is like, for me, increasing bench volume was what I needed to get things going. I had a very long plateau and that needed to happen. But training with you every day, I know that's not the answer for everybody. And I had to try to figure out why that is and have a mental model that's going to at least give me a way of trying to attack something tangibly of what is the thing that needs the dose to make progression. And I think that is where this kind of thinking is helpful, because for me, increasing bench volume may have allowed me to attack my limiter. But for you, additional bench volume may be just adding a bunch of fatigue and not actually addressing the thing you need to progress. And I think that's where these kind of, you know, different anecdotes can kind of come into play and be somewhat explained. But we'll change our minds. This will kind of progress over time. And yeah, just kind of getting initial thoughts out here. And I'm sure some people disagree, and I'll probably disagree with myself in about 6 months.
Right on. All right, we'll wrap it up there. We do have a couple questions lined up that we'll get to at some point. And we also alluded to some other segments in recent podcasts that we still haven't gotten to, but we will get to. So we have some hopefully good stuff coming in future podcasts. So to that end, make sure you subscribe to the podcast, leave a rating and review on iTunes. That'd be much appreciated. It also goes a long way if you share it with a friend, share it on social media, all that good stuff. It does help us out a lot. And lastly, if you're interested in, I guess kind of supporting what we do, you can check out the description of this podcast, no matter where you're at, kind of see some of the things we offer. And yeah, that's all we have for today.
Take care.
Thanks for tuning in and have a great one.